Well, that's the thing. Before we wrap up here, make the argument. And when I really got my arms around this over the last year, of why you believe that this money supply is going to be going up tremendously, even from the $13 trillion, because of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, funding the wars, installing democracies. Talk about that a little bit. That's really where the big inflation is going to come from, of the money supply, huh?
Indeed, I can explain it to a plumber, because they'll understand. Now, the reality is that we made this huge storage tank. It started in 1986 with the Greenspan Commission. We convinced Americans to increase their payroll taxes and take 15% of America's paycheck for 20 years and put it into a fund. That money was promptly taken and spent on other things, which it shouldn't have been, but it was. So now you have a $2 trillion hole in the Social Security Trust Fund. The only place that the money can come from, there are IOUs there, the only place that money can come from, however, is from the Treasury. And since that's going to increase the amount coming from the Treasury, there's not going to be enough money to cover the rest of the expenses in the federal budget. So the borrowing in the budget deficit has to be on the order of $300 to $500 billion a year for the next 5 years. If you just add that up, that's $1.5 to $2 trillion. Now, forced to fund that $1.5 to $2 trillion from the existing supply of money would set in motion what had started before Mr. Bernanke took office. The raising of interest rates, the bidding up of money. Money becomes dear. It's difficult to get because so much of it is needed. The federal government, in fact, crowds out every other commercial borrower in its attempt to borrow $500 billion a year out of the money supply. So the expedient of creating that $500 billion and putting it into circulation is the only politically feasible solution. If they don't do that, then they run the risk of crashing the entire bus, which is something that I don't think they will do. Mm-hmm. So that's why I believe they will instead slowly and surely inflate the money for 5 more years until we reach that magical 2012 when this peak of retirees will have passed. And that is when the real danger exists, in that window from 2011 to 2013.
You're kidding me.
No, that is it, yeah.
Isn't that interesting how that kind of coincides with this whole prophetic kind of thing of the 2012, which I'm sure you know about?
Oh, with the Mayan calendar?
All that.
Well, if I was a budget actuary, I would suggest that the people in charge of borrowing the money believe it, because, they've made it so that period is going to be the most financially tumultuous in American history. And in fact, I see things as draconian as means testing, as a wealth tax. Means testing. How much did you put away? Great. You don't need Social Security. You don't need Medicare, Medicaid. Or how much money do you have? Great. Here's a 1% tax on that total. And then the next year, you still have money? Well, we'll take another 1% of that total. Yeah. So just a tax for having money. And that is hand in hand with this new electronic system. Yeah. So that's my reasoning. And when you look at the nature of money, 96% now of everything we call money is just a blip on a computer screen. You can see we're heading there at a breakneck pace.
So this is why Andrew makes the point, and obviously this is not a show about selling gold coins, because that's just what he does for a living. But he makes the point about using your dollars and earning more Federal Reserve notes and buying things that are going to appreciate in value. Andrew, such as?
Oh, absolutely. Well, like that caller in Florida, if you don't have a house, eat peanut butter and go buy a house. That's really to do. You have to take advantage of the market whenever these tangible cycles come around. And certainly as it exists in real estate right now, this is a perfect time to get involved.
And artwork and all kinds of
art, antiques, jewelry, old automobiles.
Old automobiles, they really
collector guitars.
They hold value, right?
I like all that. So that tangible material.
So you're still bullish on real estate right now?
Indeed, I am. I think there are some great values out there. In fact, next week when the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates, that's the last trigger, which puts everybody right back where we were before they started raising interest rates. And then you'll see a wave of refinancings. You'll see homes on sale now because money will be 10% cheaper. So that means houses will be 10% cheaper. Remember, Americans don't care how much the house costs. All they care is how much down and how much a month.
Yeah.
And if it's low down and low a month, and right now especially with all the nonsense going on, I think there are some great buys out there, but it's a very small window. You're not going to see this window for a very long time.
Are there more shoes to drop on this whole credit thing? I mean,
indeed.
Is there more
Indeed.
coming down the coming? I mean, because it keeps happening every day.
Indeed. There are some very ugly things out there. In fact, I would like
Really?
the details on how we got to that negative $17 billion in the reserves. They won't identify the individual banks, but I suspect one or two of those big banks, way too big to fail, find themselves upside down right now, and that means they're worth negative money. So in theory, they should be closed right now. This is the thing that I worry about, bank panic, the fear that people have when they run to the bank and withdraw their money.
Well, that's another thing that's really not calculated into any of this when you talk about the value of the dollar.
That's right.
Are things like fear and, earth changes. I mean,
all of that's wild cards.
All that wild card stuff, right? And,
right, absolutely.
And terrorist attacks and blah, blah, blah.
Indeed, yeah.
And those things all are into the mix, which makes it into very, very interesting times, for
Indeed.
sure.
And if we're going to continue to prosecute this war, it's an unconstitutional war in my view. Not that I'm morally opposed to war, mind you, but Congress didn't declare war, so there's no war as far as I'm concerned. And if Congress wants to attack somebody, then let them, vote a resolution and follow the Constitution. If they don't, then they've abrogated their oath. Here we go again. So simply, if we're going to continue on that path of allowing these types of incursions, then we're going to have to pay for it. And it's quite expensive. Now, I know that we've been diverting the oil revenues of Iraq into the New York money markets where they didn't exist before, and that's the justification for the expense. But we're reaching a point of diminishing returns there. They're not going to be able to increase production enough to flood the market with oil as they should. So we really ought to really consider how much more we're going to spend. I unfortunately fear that, we're going to spend upwards of $2.5 trillion before we ever get close to pulling out of there, and that's going to add to our deficit as well.